That waiting gradually turned into pressure because ideas that remain only inside the mind eventually grow heavy, and Christopher felt the quiet certainty forming that observation alone would never satisfy the questions he had been carrying for so many years. He began speaking more openly about his thoughts, not loudly or confidently, but with a careful intensity that revealed how deeply he had tested them against doubt, fear, and the uncomfortable silence that often followed disagreement. Many listeners reacted with polite smiles or uncertain glances because challenging accepted beliefs made people uneasy, especially when those beliefs offered comfort, stability, and clear edges in a world already filled with danger. Christopher noticed this reaction repeatedly, and rather than discouraging him, it sharpened his awareness that new ideas rarely arrive welcomed, arriving instead like strangers who must prove themselves through persistence rather than charm. As rejection accumulated, he learned that conviction without patience could harden into stubbornness, so he forced himself to wait, refine his arguments, and quietly strengthen the logic behind his imagination. This period taught him that confidence was not a sudden spark, but a slow construction built from listening, revising, and enduring discomfort without abandoning the original question. He spent long hours studying winds, currents, and distances, connecting practical knowledge with theoretical belief, because he understood that dreams unsupported by skill often collapse when tested by reality. While others viewed the sea as a workplace or a threat, Christopher increasingly saw it as a possibility, a vast moving surface that seemed to invite questions rather than shut them down. His inner world grew louder as outer opportunities remained distant, creating a tension between readiness and delay that tested his patience more than any storm ever had. Despite uncertainty, he continued refining his vision, believing that clarity would eventually matter more than approval, even though loneliness often accompanied that belief. There were moments when exhaustion tempted him to abandon his ideas, especially when practical life demanded attention, yet the thought of surrender felt heavier than continuing forward without guarantees. He began traveling between courts and sponsors, learning quickly that persuasion required more than logic, because fear, pride, and politics often guided decisions more strongly than curiosity. Each conversation taught him something, whether about human nature or about himself, reinforcing the understanding that belief must adapt in presentation without losing its core. He learned to soften his words without softening his vision, adjusting tone while holding firmly to purpose, a balance that took years to develop. Waiting stretched on, yet Christopher's sense of time changed because impatience gradually transformed into preparation and frustration slowly hardened into resolve. What once felt like uncertain wandering began to resemble direction, even though no destination had yet agreed to accept him. He noticed that doubt no longer weakened him as before, because he had lived with it so long that it became familiar rather than frightening. In quiet moments, he imagined what it might feel like to finally replace theory with experience, thought with movement, and hesitation with action. These imagined moments were not celebrations in his mind, but tests, because he understood that success would demand responsibility rather than applause. The weight of possible failure never disappeared, yet it no longer controlled him, because fear loses power when faced daily without retreat. Gradually, his ideas stopped feeling like private thoughts and began to behave like plans, structured, demanding, and impatient. He prepared himself mentally for rejection even as hope remained, because expectation tempered by realism protected him from collapse. The world around him seemed unchanged, yet internally he sensed a shift, as if the long season of gathering had reached its quiet conclusion. He did not yet know how events would unfold, but he knew he was no longer merely waiting, because readiness had replaced wondering. This realization brought calm rather than excitement, since clarity often arrives quietly rather than with drama. He accepted that action would involve risk, misunderstanding, and consequence, yet these no longer felt like reasons to stop. The child who once watched ships leave now understood that watching was only the first lesson, and that departure carried meaning only when one stepped aboard. Christopher felt the subtle change from observer to participant even before opportunity made it official. His imagination, once restless and unanchored, had become focused, sharpened by years of restraint. Rather than fantasizing freely, he now imagined carefully, measuring possibility against limitation without abandoning vision. He understood that belief demanded commitment, not because certainty was absolute, but because movement itself revealed truth. Each delay strengthened his endurance, preparing him for longer trials he could sense but not yet see. He learned that patience was not passive, but active waiting filled with preparation. His story, still unseen by history, had reached a turning point defined not by action yet taken, but by readiness achieved. What lay ahead would test more than knowledge, because courage would be required even after decisions were made. Christopher carried both doubt and determination forward together, no longer trying to separate them. He realized that uncertainty might never vanish, but it no longer needed to decide his direction. The quiet boy from the harbor had become a man shaped by questions rather than answers. As plans edged closer to reality, his imagination grew steadier, less wild, more focused. He was not chasing glory, but resolution, hoping action would finally answer questions thought could not. The horizon he once watched from shore now seemed closer, not because it moved, but because he finally stood ready to approach it. With preparation complete and patience tested to its limits, Christopher reached the edge of waiting, where belief prepared to become action, and the future leaned forward, listening. Christopher Columbus is often remembered as a loud name and history books, yet his earliest years were shaped less by shouting triumphs and more by quiet wondering, because long before ships and maps he carried a restless curiosity that made him feel both excited by the world and strangely apart from it. He grew up knowing the feeling of dreaming bigger than his surroundings allowed, while also sensing that such dreams made other people uneasy, creating a tension between belonging and imagining that followed him like a shadow he could never quite outrun. Even as a child, Christopher seemed pulled between certainty and doubt, because he believed the world must be larger than anyone admitted, yet he worried that wanting more than others expected might leave him wandering alone. Born in the port city of Genoa, surrounded by salt air rope sails and the endless movement of ships, he absorbed the rhythm of departure and return, learning early that some people stayed put while others felt drawn toward distant horizons they could not explain. The harbor was always busy, but young Christopher often felt solitary within the crowd, watching sailors laugh loudly while secretly wondering where their stories ended once the ships vanished beyond the edge of sight. He listened carefully to travelers, merchants, and seafarers, collecting fragments of tales like scattered shells, because each story hinted that the known world might only be a small piece of something far greater. While many children focused on trades they could inherit, Christopher's thoughts drifted toward maps, stars, and rumors, sensing that understanding directions and distances offered a different kind of power than tools or coins. Schooling for him was uneven and uncertain, yet learning never truly stopped because he taught himself through listening, watching, and quietly testing ideas against his own stubborn imagination. Christopher noticed that adults often claimed certainty while disagreeing with one another, which planted the idea that accepted knowledge might be less solid than it appeared, encouraging him to question answers that felt too comfortable. He was not especially loud or charming as a boy, but he possessed a steady intensity that made people pause, as if they sensed his thoughts were traveling farther than the conversation allowed. Religion surrounded his childhood, offering both comfort and mystery, and Christopher absorbed its language deeply, connecting faith with the idea that the universe followed hidden rules waiting to be discovered. As he grew, the sea became more than scenery because its shifting surface reflected his own thoughts, sometimes calm and inviting, sometimes dark and restless, never fully predictable. Working on ships during his youth, he learned discipline and danger together, discovering that courage was less about bravado and more about quiet persistence when uncertainty refused to fade. Life at sea taught him to observe carefully because survival depended on noticing subtle changes in wind, sky, and water, habits that slowly shaped his patience and attention to detail. Even among other sailors, Christopher often felt inwardly alone, replaying conversations in his mind and weighing possibilities long after others had moved on to laughter or sleep. Maps fascinated him not as finished answers, but as arguments full of gaps, because every blank space invited imagination to step forward and suggest that the unknown was not empty, only waiting. He spent long evenings studying charts and notes, comparing claims and contradictions, gradually forming the belief that accepted boundaries existed partly because no one had yet dared to challenge them seriously. Such thoughts made him both hopeful and uneasy, since believing the world was larger also meant accepting that proving it could demand years of uncertainty and rejection. Christopher was not blind to fear, and in quiet moments he wondered whether his ideas were foolish dreams, yet the discomfort of staying still always felt heavier than the risk of being wrong. In crowded rooms, he sometimes felt invisible, which sharpened his habit of listening rather than speaking, gathering strength through observation rather than attention. People close to him noticed his seriousness, occasionally teasing him for staring too long at nothing, unaware that his mind was busy traveling through possibilities invisible to everyone else. Though humor did not come naturally, he possessed a gentle irony, quietly aware that many confident declarations about the world rested on surprisingly fragile assumptions. As friendships formed and faded, Christopher learned that isolation could be painful, yet it also protected his inner world, allowing ideas to grow without being immediately dismissed. He watched others accept inherited paths with relief, while he felt restless at the thought of repeating familiar patterns, sensing that curiosity, once ignored, only grew more demanding. Travel widened his perspective, showing him diverse customs and beliefs, reinforcing the idea that truth often depended on where one stood rather than on any single explanation. The more he saw, the less satisfied he became with easy answers, because complexity fascinated him more than certainty ever could. Whispers of ancient texts and daring theories reached his ears, suggesting alternative understandings of distance and direction that quietly challenged accepted wisdom. Christopher did not adopt these ideas recklessly, but weighed them carefully, combining study with intuition, as if reason and imagination were partners rather than rivals. His confidence grew slowly, built not on applause, but on repetition, doubt, and careful reflection, making his resolve quieter yet surprisingly strong. Despite growing conviction, uncertainty never fully vanished, because believing deeply also meant carrying the fear of being deeply mistaken. He learned patience from waiting, humility from doubt, and determination from the constant pull of unanswered questions. At times, he wondered whether his longing for distant horizons was selfish, yet he also sensed that curiosity itself carried responsibility. Conversations often ended with him thinking further than words aloud, replaying ideas late into the night while others slept without trouble. The future remained undefined, yet possibility felt close, like a door not yet opened but frequently touched. Christopher's youth was not marked by triumph, but by preparation, as uncertainty slowly sharpened his focus rather than weakening his spirit. He came to understand that imagination was not escape, but a tool that demanded courage to use honestly. Even before opportunity appeared, he carried the weight of potential, sensing that his inner restlessness might one day demand action rather than thought. For now, he remained suspended between belief and proof, learning quietly, watching constantly, and waiting for the moment when wondering would no longer feel enough.